From the virtual stage of the 92nd Street Y, hello and welcome to our civic series, Race to City Hall. My name is Seth Pinsky and I'm the CEO of the 92nd Street Y. I'm honored to be here to host these one-on-one conversations with leading mayoral candidates covering topics of importance to all New Yorkers, including some suggested by members of our 92nd Street Y community. Thank you all so much for joining us. As we all know, the last year has been an incredibly difficult one for our city. To overcome our challenges, New York is going to need a decisive, collaborative, and creative chief executive. It is for this reason that we at the 92nd Street Y have launched this series. Today, I'm speaking with mayoral candidate Art Chang. Before he announced his candidacy, Mr. Chang has had extensive experience in the public sector. He was the first Asian American appointed to the New York City Campaign Finance Board, and in addition served at the Empire State Development Corporation, where he helped lead the development of the Queens West project in Long Island City, and at the New York City Voter Assistance Advisory Committee, CUNY, the New York City Law Department, and the Brooklyn Public Library. In the private sector, Mr. Chang has served as a managing director at JP Morgan Chase and has been an entrepreneur, having founded and led several tech companies. Mr. Chang, thank you so much for being here and talking with me. Before diving into questions about your positions on various policies, I wanted to start by asking how you and your family have been holding up during the pandemic.
We've been very privileged and very lucky. We've been safe here in Brooklyn. We have a wonderful house. My oldest son has actually been attending college remotely in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's been extraordinarily difficult for him. And so he's now working as a ski lift operator, which has been a great way for him to spend, a year, at least we'll go see what happens in the summer. And my younger son is preparing to graduate from Brooklyn Tech and waiting for his final college admission letters to come in. And, then I'm running a campaign from my house. It's very efficient, actually, sitting here in my home on back-to-back Zoom meetings.
Well, I'm glad to hear that everyone is holding up, and good luck to your son on his admissions process.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. The 92nd Street Y is one of my favorite places. I can't wait for it to reopen.
Well, we can't wait to host you. So normally I like to start these conversations with questions from our patrons, but for reasons that will probably be obvious in a second, for our conversation, I wanted to start with a question that comes directly from recent headlines. And as you well know, between the shootings in Atlanta of a couple of weeks ago and the recent horrific attack in Midtown on a defenseless elderly Filipino American, we've seen a really disturbing upsurge in bias crimes directed against members of the Asian community in the United States. As someone who's married to a Korean American woman and whose children therefore are half Korean, I've obviously been very much aware of this rising menace, and I'm sure as a prominent Asian American yourself, you're even more aware of it. So I wanted just to start by asking what you think we as a city and country can be doing about this horrible trend.
Well, I'll just start by saying that, I grew up in the all-white Middle West, where I never felt like I belonged, and I never felt like I fit in, and I was always different. And I moved to New York. One of the major reasons I moved to New York is because this is a place where I thought I could belong. And for many years, I did feel like I belonged here. And I feel like this is a city where everyone should feel like they belong, where they all fit in, where we all welcome everybody. And the recent spate of anti-Asian hate, which is across the nation, but particularly acute right here in New York City, has been deeply unsettling. It's for the first time since I was a kid, I really feel this potential of not belonging. Like I have one foot in, but one foot out. And I don't really belong in either place. And what is super important to me is the sense that we recapture this sense of belonging for everybody, because this is a problem that people have had of all races, right, of all gender types across the city. And COVID and the pandemic have really exacerbated this. We need to come together. There's been some really tremendously encouraging things that I've seen. There's been tremendous outreach from the Jewish community, who has had their own experience with hate. From the Black community, I was particularly really encouraged and warmed by the statements that Jumaane Williams made at a peace vigil, where he said, Asians stood with us during the BLM protests, and it's time for us to stand with you. And that's the feeling that I'm getting kind of across the city, that yes, we are seeing this, but everybody is much more acutely aware of how we have to form these bonds across our different communities to combat this episode of hate.
Well, I can certainly say definitively that we at the 92nd Street Y and the Jewish community stands with the Asian community, and we obviously stand with all communities that are under threat and that have hatred directed at them. So I just wanted to express my personal and our institutional support to you and your family and the entire Asian community in New York.
Thank you. And how are your kids handling this and your family? I wanted to.
I appreciate your asking. I mean, we're fortunate in that it hasn't directly impacted us. And as a family that's also Jewish, we've obviously, been aware of the threat that we all face from hatred. And so, this is a moment at which I think we recognize that it's necessary for us to once again stand up against hatred of any kind. And to say that it's never acceptable. But
and one thing that one way my behavior has changed is on the subway, I now look for Asians on the platform or in the cars, and I try to go and stand next to them, especially elderly Asians, and just to be there in case something happens, but even more important, just to show solidarity and support. And so it's made me really acutely aware of who we are and how and where we stand in this city, and and this terrible impact that I think some of the model minority myths have had on our community. Because I think some people don't know that the Asian community has actually the highest poverty rate in the entire city of any ethnic group. That we have the highest increase in the number of hate attacks. We have the highest unemployment rate, the lowest weekly wages of any ethnic group. And then, after COVID hit and the president's, objectionable remarks, it had a direct impact on the economies of Flushing and Chinatown. In Chinatown, the revenues in restaurants dropped by 98%. Flushing, it was 80%. So these are really devastating times for our community. And, thank you for that question.
No, and listen, it's a topic that I feel like we could spend our entire 45 minutes discussing, but I want to make sure that we hit on some other topics as well. And I want to pick up on a point that you just made about the economy specifically. The downturn has, as you pointed out, had an impact on communities all across the city, and it's impacted people regardless of race or gender, although certainly there have been some areas and some communities that have been harder hit than others. But the statistics are really quite alarming. At the end of January, we were down something like 600,000 jobs from where we were the previous January in the private sector. Our unemployment rate is almost 4 times as high as it was last year. And there are parts of the city, like in the Bronx, where unemployment is almost at 20%, which is incredible. So I want to ask you this. Let's say that the election goes the way that you hope it does, and you're elected in November, and on January 1st, you take the oath of office and sit down at your desk at City Hall. What would be the first 3 or 4 major policies that you would put in place that you think would have not just the greatest, but also the quickest impact on our economic situation?
It's very hard to rebuild from nothing. It is going to be a lot easier to rebuild from something. And so if we sit back and we look at this interconnection between, the businesses and our community, we have to preserve what we have first before we can actually build from there. And I'll say this about small businesses. So what people misunderstand about New York City is that small businesses have really been the engine of growth. That before COVID, small businesses represented over 50% of the employment of New York City. That actually the city's largest businesses decreased employment, so that almost 100% of the employment growth in the city came from small businesses. And yet when the shutdown happened, there's almost no special regard made to small businesses, and the relief came very, very late, which led to the decimation of a lot of the small businesses as we see, in the shuttered storefronts on our streets. So we can't let that continue to get worse, right? We have to keep businesses in their stores, but we also need to keep people in their homes, and the two are inextricably linked. Because if we allow the city to go through an eviction crisis where we see, what is today, a population the size of Boston, facing potential eviction, and scores and hundreds of small landlords facing potential repossession, we can't allow that to happen. They have to say we have to preserve our community fabric. So that's the first thing. So with respect to small businesses, so there are a lot of tools that we can do. We can keep people in their stores, keep the businesses in their stores. We can use the city's power on property taxes and other fees to be able to think about having forbearance on those. A lot of store owners have faced penalties and accrued interest from this. Let's think about wiping those things out. And then let's also create a fund to be able to get folks back on their feet. For restaurant owners, I'm super fond of all my restaurants. We have to keep them going, and part of that means giving them a longer time horizon so that they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Extend street seating out till 2022 at the minimum. Embark on a major replanning of the streets to make that more permanent. We need to think about really using the city's marketing power to bring marketing and attention back to these businesses. And then for so many of the businesses, especially, Black businesses owned by people of color, we need to help them acquire the digital tools and to upgrade their business capabilities. And we can do that in partnership with experienced entrepreneurs and with business schools. I'm proposing creating an urban innovation core to do just that.
I want to pick up on one of the points that you just made, and I'll come back in a few minutes to one of the others. But the proposals that I've read coming out of your campaign about, in particular, a moratorium on eviction for small businesses, I guess there were two questions that I had, because in some ways the concept seems like a very compelling one. But I guess the two questions that I had were, one, how do you avoid the moral hazard of businesses that can afford to pay rent, just choosing not to pay rent if you put an eviction moratorium in place? And then the second question I had was, especially outside of Manhattan, a lot of the owners of the properties that these small businesses are located in are themselves small businesses. And so if you have an eviction moratorium in place, how do you avoid transferring essentially the problem from one set of small businesses to another set of small businesses?
It's a great question. So I'll address the first one, which has to do with the moral hazard issue. I'm a firm believer in means testing, but I'm also aware that the city, because we collect individual income taxes, and we also have business taxes, that we actually have a good sense of whether people are doing well or not. So we have a mechanism in place, we have the data, but we're just not leveraging it. And through these one-size-fits-all policies that we've been experiencing over the past 8 years, we're now kind of mentally accustomed to government says this one thing and everybody does and is all going to go that way, but it doesn't have to. Right? It can be much more nuanced on a block by block, building by building, neighborhood by neighborhood basis, and it should do just that. So the point about the small landlords is a fantastic one, because small landlords are really getting left out in the lurch here. I mean, and I'm not talking about just the ones in the commercial space, but also the ones in the residential space. There are 50,000 properties, small landlords who are right now delinquent on their property taxes. And that indicates a hardship level for those owners. So there are a couple of things that the city can do. And this relates, by the way, to residential mortgages as well, is that, by extending out the mortgage moratorium, the eviction moratorium, we also need to have an accompanying, foreclosure moratorium. For businesses, for owners who have mortgages, we need to work with the financial services industry. And I have one idea that I've run through a number of people, which is to extend the term of the mortgages and essentially cut the mortgages at a period and then create a payment-free zone so that the landlords who then can essentially not have to pay the mortgages during that period, and they can pass that benefit along to their tenants. And so for tenants, especially who've built up accumulated debt, accrued debt from this moratorium, whether they're small businesses or residences, could have that debt wiped out. It's the only way to do it, other than having some massive multi-billion-dollar relief bill. Because the relief bill, by the way, we have about $2 to $3 billion of unpaid and accrued rents and property taxes that are in this system. And every month that goes along, that gets larger and larger. So we need a way to wipe it out. If we can do this through the mortgages, we spread the risk across the largest number of people, really minimizing that pain to a very de minimis amount. The other thing is, and this is where the city can really, have a huge impact, is in the property taxes, other fees, penalties, and other things. So if a business has accrued penalties from things like tickets, well, just wipe them out. If a business has, because obviously all businesses pay some portion of the building owner's property taxes. So if the building owner is unable to pay property taxes because of this forbearance, then we need to deal with the property taxes and bring forbearance for those landlords as well, and that goes to other fees.
But let me then pick up on that, because when you look at the city's budget, this year it now looks like things will be okay because the federal stimulus bill is going to deliver billions of dollars, not just to the state, but directly to the city as well. But the mayor's own January budget plan forecast that for as far as the forecast went out, I think it was fiscal year 2025, there were basically $4 to $5 billion deficits year after year after year. So if you're elected, when you come into office, probably all of the stimulus money will have been spent and you'll be facing those deficits. And now you're proposing foregoing property taxes from these small landlords in order to help the small businesses and them as well, which is understandable, but that's money out of the city's coffers. There are other proposals about subsidized universal childcare. Again, very important policy, but it costs money. So I guess the specific question I have is kind of like with the economy. So you come into office on January 1st and your budget director comes to you and says, yep, everything that they said was true. The cupboards are bare. What exactly would you do to close a $4+ billion budget gap? What revenues would you look to increase? What expenses would you look to cut? And if you can answer that with some specificity, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just talk about property taxes for just to start with. So if we have forbearance on property taxes, we're not, I'm not proposing that we, eliminate the property tax payments or forgive them in their entirety. It's essentially refinancing them. Well, we can create a vehicle to sell those property taxes to have debt actually against those property tax revenues in the future. So I think we can make ourselves nearly entirely whole on that through financing techniques. Obviously, we'd need to make sure that those work with the controller's office and et cetera. But, they're at least just on the face of it, as a finance person, I can tell you that those things seem sensible. The second thing is on the budget overall. The budget, as you well know, is $92 billion today. It has grown by $18 billion in real dollar terms in the past 8 years. And there's been a huge increase in overhead and administration costs across the city agencies. So, others have asked, well, where has that money gone to? Well, there have been some good things, right? Like universal pre-K4. There's been some construction of affordable housing. There have been some things, but I would argue that a lot of the spending has come because of the way that the city has managed, that this administration has managed the city's budget and has organized the city to be more siloed and more compartmentalized with fewer integrated agencies. And as a result, you have duplicative services among them, and you have a lot of embedded overhead. So let's go into some of the categories. So the mayor's office has increased headcount by 41%. 41%. It's an astonishing number. And while it's not that large relative to the overall budget of the city, it's so important from a symbolic perspective, right? So fiscal responsibility has to stop at the top. And at the same time, we look at the Department of Education. Now, I'm all for spending for kids' education and direct services, but overall, the education budget has grown by $15 billion over the past 8 years. But we know that only 1.1 billion of that went to pay for universal pre-K4. So where did the other 14 billion go? Right, it's a very, very good question. We know that the NYPD has a massive civilian workforce, right? That was intended to be phased out, but it's only grown, right? There are about 15,000 people who work as civilians inside of the NYPD. So there's a lot of budget that we need to kind of look at. But the really, really big thing that nobody is talking about is really procurement, right? The OTPS, other than personal services budget for the city, is about $35 billion. About $20 billion of that is procurement. So when is the last time the city has had real procurement reform? Right, we know about half of that spending comes from very large contracts, and that a substantial amount of that is coming from consulting and professional services. So I think we need to take a really, really hard look at the procurement number and figure out how we can inject more competitive bidding, streamline the entire process of awarding contracts, paying people, and make that whole process much more efficient and competitive. And one of the areas where we need to think about procurement is actually putting the city's entire health plan out to bid. I don't think it's been rebid in the past 8 years. While the workforce has grown to almost 330,000 people. So we have economies of scale that we can get from refinancing and competitive bidding in some of those areas. And then we need to look also at the capital budget. I mean, we're in this period right now with very low interest rates. And so the debt service has actually declined over the past 8 years thanks to that. But there are agencies like the NYPD whose debt service has increased enormously by over $100 million. And you have to look at that and go, well, what are these things being spent for? And are they actually increasing the well-being of people at the ground level? Because if they're not, the way we pay for it is through this debt service. So this is how detailed we need to get. And we can't do a one-size-fits-all. We're going to have to look department by department, bureau by bureau, and really get down into the details of this while we look for efficiencies. So I think the next mayor cannot depend on manna from heaven, right? The federal government right now is split 50-50. Biden has lots of fantastic proposals on the table, but there's no guarantee if and when that will come. The city has no ability to unilaterally raise taxes. So I think raising taxes does make sense, but the mayor doesn't have the ability to do that. That has to come from Albany. So, we have to think about how we do more with what we have. How do we make ourselves as efficient as possible? And then how do we streamline things? We are going to have to think about reducing headcount. The Municipal Labor Commission wrote a letter to Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio back in May, offering to enter into a discussion about early retirement, right, for a lot of municipal workers. So the labor councils are willing to have that conversation. They should be partners in this. So we're going to need to enlist the entire city workforce, all the labor unions, all the frontline workers, and get all the ideas on how we can streamline and make our city more efficient. We're also going to need to bring in the private sector, because as I know from my experience working at the Campaign Finance Board, where I co-created NYC Votes, we can leverage tools, people, and services from the private sector to do pro bono work on behalf of the government where it makes sense. And we can expand this. We have all these universities who can come in. There are so many opportunities to do more with less.
So I guess from one very difficult issue, which is making city government more efficient, to another very difficult issue, which is housing. And you have alluded to housing in some of your earlier questions and the challenge that we face with the threat of eviction. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in your online platform is when you talk about the housing crisis the city has faced at this point for decades now. The statement that you make is that the only way really to solve the housing problem is through increased production of housing supply. To me, at least, that's always been the obvious answer. But as anyone who's been involved in government knows, it's also a politically very fraught answer, because while people generally are in favor of seeing more housing built, when you actually propose something next door to someone, suddenly that person says, well, not here. And so I guess the question that I have for you is, coming from the position that you do, that the long-term solution to the housing crisis is more housing production, how do you convince the many New Yorkers, and to be fair, especially among the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, how do you convince the people there that growth and development are actually a good thing for New York rather than something that should be opposed?
A lot of the differences among us come from, I think, a lack of trust. And over the past 8 years, I think a lot of the progressive promises have failed to be realized, right? They're just pipe dreams. So, we need to kind of create a sense of we can get it done. One of the things that really heartened me when I started thinking about running was I talked to many people of different political views, from the left to the right. And I asked, well, how do you feel about these statements? Every New Yorker deserves a roof over their head, food on their table, quality education, equal opportunity to grow. And, the answer is not surprising. Everybody wants the same thing. We all want that. And the question is, how do we actually get there? So again, we have to get very specific about what we mean in things like housing. So part of it means that we have to kind of look at this from a holistic perspective. The city has grown over the past 30 years by about 1 million people. But we've also experienced a massive split in the benefits of that growth, right? We've had this income divide has never been bigger. The wealth gap has never been bigger. And the city has produced insufficient amounts of housing. And this goes back to that supply-demand equation, right? So supply-demand, you have increasing demand without increasing supply, prices go up, things get less affordable. But then if you're also shifting the number of people down to the lower income category, and you're building almost no new construction for the lowest income folks, and then you have the situations like NYCHA, where you have about 640,000 people living in homes that were designed for 440,000 people. And this was exacerbated by the city's own policies about land retention and land acquisition. For the past 8 years, the mayor's policy on property lien delinquencies has been to do lien sales, selling them to collection agencies in essence, which just further exacerbates gentrification and other things. But, the city has done in the past, the city has used the property lien delinquencies and its first lien position as a method to accumulate and acquire bigger portfolio of properties. The best way to reduce the cost of construction is through owning the land and contributing the land. So we need to increase the city's portfolio. And this means real property assets. This means air rights. This means thinking creatively about things like parking lots and parking garages, things about thinking toward the future about a more car-free New York, a more pedestrian-friendly New York, and how we can recapture land for that. And then we have to start doing what the private sector does, which is to start trading properties and assets so that we can accumulate parcels that can then be contributed to some of these new housing programs. And then finally, the financing on it and I want to come back to how we get people to accept this.
Yeah, that was going to be my question.
Yeah. So the city, in the same way that I've just suggested that the city needs to expand the variety of its real property assets, the city also needs to expand the variety of tools at its disposal. And one of the things that we really need to think hard about is how we use social housing, right? And what we've seen in places like Co-op City has been a very, very successful use of limited ownership over properties where the city or the state owns the ground and the real property assets, and the tenants own the buildings and the operations. So I think we've seen some of that in the private sector sense in some of the RAD projects, but can we actually use that financing creatively to think about how we expand the financing available to this low-income housing? And then going back to how people are going to accept this, the big problem that we've had with all of these proposals is the ad hoc, fragmented approach to this, where we say, okay, we're going to build, affordable housing here. We're going to put a homeless shelter there. We're going to do these things that interrupt your community. And everyone sits back and they go like, wait, is this fair? I think the ultimate question is this fair? Going back to where I started on this question, everybody wants the same thing, but they want it to be fair. So what the city needs to do, the obligation of the next mayor, is to create a citywide plan that shows how this is going to be done. I've learned a lot from watching the Regional Plan Association over the past 30 years, where I come up with regional plans for how we redistribute things in a more equitable fashion, redistribute the responsibilities as well as the benefits. We also have climate change coming up with the 6-foot to 10-foot sea rise in the next 80 years. All of these things need to be considered in how we plan for our city. So we're going to need to densify. Well, that's a risk, but it's also a great opportunity. We're going to need to think differently about transportation. That's a risk, but it's also a great opportunity. So we need to go in and go, here's what we're going to do, and here's how it's fair. Here's why it's fair. Here's how we're going to roll it out. And let's do this together.
And just a quick question. Do you feel confident that, let's say in your own neighborhood in Brownstone, Brooklyn, that you could convince people in that neighborhood that they're going to have to accept significantly more density along with the rest of the city?
Yes, but it's going to have to be done in the right way. I mean, what we learned from the Atlantic Yards project, what we're seeing in the opposition to the high rise next to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, are projects that are going up that have been done without the necessary transparency to build trust. And then in the case of Atlantic Yard, it really felt like a bait and switch, right? There was a proposal for a certain amount of density, and then, oops, the density doubled at one point, and to the shock of the surrounding neighborhood, without any real explanation or without any real transparency. So I think we can get to these points, but we have to think about a different approach to this. The existing ULURP process has to be revamped. I mean, it doesn't work. It leads inevitably to these kinds of disputes and outcomes. We need to start the partnership with the communities much, much earlier, and we need to ensure that developers or others who are responsible are being transparent, fully transparent, much earlier. And that's really up to the mayor and to the mayor's abilities to drive that in the development area.
So thank you for that. And I want to just make sure that we go from kind of crisis to crisis, because as you say, that you're running because of the variety of crises facing the city, and we have a lot of them. The crisis I wanted to turn to next is the crisis that our arts and cultural institutions are facing. And it was heartening to see that of the 9 major topics that you focused on your webpage, one of them is reviving arts and culture in the city. And this pandemic has had a devastating impact on arts and culture. I think overall the city lost at the low point something like 20% of all jobs, 30% of all jobs, but something like 20% of those have come back. Whereas in the arts and culture sector, we've lost something like 70% of all jobs, and only 5% of them have come back. But even with these grim figures, there's still the fact that we're facing issues with rising crime, with homelessness, with racial injustices. So the question for you is, how do you convince New Yorkers that now is the right time to be facing and addressing this particular crisis instead of putting it on the back burner and focusing on others first?
Yeah, so there are three simple reasons. Number one is that the arts are businesses. It's the arts, every art institution is a small business. 92nd Street Y is a small business. So it hires people, it has revenue, it pays payroll taxes. It is a small business. So let's get the businesses back up and running. Let's preserve them, let's keep them in place, make sure they can operate. The second thing is that the arts are an intrinsic part of who we are as human beings, right? It is, it's our culture, it's our way of expressing ourselves. We know that the arts are, forms of learning. So we need to expand the arts in the schools as well. But the arts are super, super important. And the third element is really a branding one, right? One of the city's great competitive advantages is that we are the cultural capital of the United States. And for us to remain that, to bring back the tourism industry, to grow this, we have to preserve and protect the arts industry. It is so important. It is who we are. I would say it's even more so who we are than advertising or tech or any of the other large industries. The arts represent who we are. It's why people want to come to New York. It's what they do when they come here. And it's what we as residents do, as stage actors, as stage hands, right, as musicians. I mean, my very first job was teaching music. And half of the startups that I've worked on have been involved in supporting the creative professions in one way or the other. This is an incredibly important thing to me personally. It's, I moved to Fort Greene because Spike Lee was down the street and it was the home of hip hop. It is who we are. So let's do it.
So let's say that you've sold me. The arts are critical. But what, and maybe if you can answer this briefly, what do you think the prescription is? Then what do we do to try to revive this this critical sector for not just New York's economy, but for the soul of New York?
We're going to have an expansion. We have to have some debt financing, for one thing. We need to provide a financing vehicle, a loan facility, so that institutions in crisis can borrow low interest rate loans, borrow low interest rate money guaranteed by the backing of the city. And we can do all kinds of financing mechanisms against that, right? We can sell bonds down the road. We can sell them as debt instruments. So we can structure that and make that happen, right? That seems like a no-brainer to me. But we also need to make sure that we protect the people who work in the arts industry. One of the gaping holes this really revealed was the lack of benefits, right, that freelancers and gig workers have. And so we're going to need to think really hard about how we address that. So that's the second component. The third part is that we have to use our marketing budget. I think the city, given what's happening with COVID and the vaccination rate, we can be planning for the winter and into the 2022 and be thinking about citywide initiatives to start to generate tourism and even local tourism to the city to participate in lots of our arts-driven events.
So just because we're getting short on time, I want to make sure to hit at least one or two questions from our patrons. And there was one that particularly intrigued me, of someone who I guess had read your website closely and pointed out that on your website, when you speak about the fight against anti-Asian bias, you talk about the role that education can play in the fight, and you talk about the fact that it's very important to tell the story of Black Americans, but of all Americans of color, which is a very compelling point. And then you go on to say, and this is really what my question is, given the critical importance of education in AAPI culture, the next mayor must also abandon the divisive anti-Asian language and policies of the current mayor. And so the question that our patron was asking is, what specifically are you referring to here?
I spent 2 years as the chair of the school leadership team at Brooklyn Technical High School, which is 60% Asian. And I think there is no question that Asians across the city view the attacks on the specialized high schools as an attack on Asians. And there has been, we've heard nothing from City Hall about how we increase the access to quality education, how we increase the access to advanced education. And for the Asian community, it's so critically important. I mean, at Brooklyn Tech, it's majority immigrant, it is majority free school lunch, and it is 40% Title I. I mean, we are not we're not a rich people. And so for the mayor to address the cancellation or seek the cancellation of the specialized high schools, seemed like a direct attack, and he did nothing to refute that proposition. And we heard that loud and clear. We heard that loud and clear in the PEPs and the other public settings. So it's as if we don't exist. It's as if we don't have a voice. It's not anti-Asian by being racist. It's anti-Asian by conscious omission and conscious avoidance of talking about our communities as one of the communities who are in dire need of help.
And just as a final question then, looking at the specialized high schools, which have done such amazing things for so many people, serving as a ladder to the middle class and beyond for generations of immigrants, generations of poor people in New York. It is clear, though, that there are certain communities that are dramatically underrepresented in those schools. So do you have any thoughts about how you would address that in maybe a more positive way rather than the negative way that you're describing?
Yeah. The problem with the specialized high school is that the pie is very small. I mean, the greatest city in the country should have the greatest high schools in the country. And so how do we do two things? How do we expand the pie on the one hand? And then how do we make it more equitable? So expanding the pie to me means we use the tools of the modern age. We have online learning, classes offered by MIT, Harvard. We have CUNY right here, NYU. We can do a better integration of high school to college to expand that pie. The second thing, and I think I really want to point this out, is that Brooklyn Tech, for example, 20 years ago was 50% Black. And nobody talks about that. And nobody talks about the reasons why it has gone from being 50% Black to single-digit percentages Black. And the reason is that the city Department of Education, led by the chancellor and the mayor, have failed to market and to promote the specialized high schools in these communities. It's not a failure. It's the fault doesn't lie with the specialized high schools. The fault lies in the chancellor and the mayor.
I feel like we could spend another 45 minutes talking about just this topic, let alone all the other topics that there are to discuss. But unfortunately, we're out of time. So I wanted to thank you very much for sharing your plans for our city with us. And to say to our 92nd Street Y patrons, thank you for supporting and tuning in to the Race to City Hall series. Please check back on our website for the most up-to-date schedule of future conversations. And in the meantime, from the virtual stage in the 92nd Street Y, we're signing off. We appreciate your joining us very much.